Hafide, thank you so much, Sudus Maasi, for coming and spending some of your time here this afternoon. And we're very pleased to provide this presentation to you. I'm so proud and honored to be part of this panel. And in thinking about how I was going to introduce everybody, we could do it the more formal way, but everybody is so accomplished by now. Everyone who's part of this panel has been participating and presenting, studying, researching, advocating for so many years, if not decades, that it actually becomes quite a lengthy proposal to introduce everyone. So I thought I would present from the heart, really. And like I said, everyone here has basically given their life or much of their life to studying, knowing, learning, reaching out to elders, cultural practitioners, studying the history themselves, and so much more, and then sharing it with all of you. So with that, I'll begin with our first presenter, who is Baltazar Aguon. And so for this panel on CHamoru expressions of identity over time, we found it so appropriate to start with Baltazar. He has gone on this personal journey that has created this profound awakening and this sense of obligation and responsibility to do what is right for the land and the people that through this journey he will be telling you about, that he now feels this very close and personal connection to. But over the many years, I have admired Bal's work so much. In teaching historian Guåhan, or the history of Guam classes that I have over the many years, I have used the films and the material that he has created year after year after year. He has created films about exploring the challenges that we all face today, and from looking at the suffering and the costs that were paid that have gotten us to today, and so much more. So the journey that he has been taking, and he's going to continue us forward on, is no less of a large feat. It's one that's very compelling, and I think is going to inspire a lot of us in so many different ways. So with that, let me introduce Baltazar Aguon and call him forward to begin his presentation.
Thank you, Dr. Kelly. That was way more than I knew I did. And everybody knows my birthday. So if you're wondering what January 6th was, Tamuning Guam, 5:41 a.m., that was the day I was born. I was born at a time when the people of Guam were a decade and 4 years into being citizens of the United States of America. In grade school, we were taught the Pledge of Allegiance, who the first president of America was, and the capitals of the states. I have a vivid memory in 4th grade thinking, why can't we learn about Guam? Our main subjects were English and math, social studies and science. In high school, we had civics and algebra, American history, American government, and citizenship. We were taught to be good Americans, and that the foundation of America was built on freedom and equality. At the end of my freshman year at FD, I, along with half the class, were forbidden to return for this next school year. We were delinquenti. We were delinquents. By the second semester of my sophomore year at JFK, my delinquency reached a breaking point with my parents, and I was shipped off to the good old USA. Beaverton, Oregon, to be exact. It was here where I had a profound awakening in in self-identity. I was asked by my English teacher if I could say a few words to the class about Guam. Guam is a U.S. territory in the Western Pacific, halfway between Australia and Japan. It's a tropical island, and the people are CHamoru. Do they still truck spears? A student asked. Do the women still go topless? Another woman asked. Class, stop this right now, the teacher admonished. At this point, I realized that no one knew anything about Guam, that it was a part of America, and the people were U.S. citizens. What's worse is that I realized beyond surface-level facts of location and political status, and beyond lived experiences of church, fiestas, and quasi-American rituals, I knew nothing about my home and people. I couldn't tell them that we were the first seafaring people to venture into the remote Pacific thousands of years ago, with the stars, the wind, the birds, and the swell of the seas as their guides. Or that our society was built on the strength of our women, a matrilineal backbone that kept our culture alive through 3 different colonizations. But in that hole, there was an atom, an ethereal thread, something that reminded me that who I am and what I am is connected to something so profoundly beautiful. So I took a deep breath and answered those students. Only on Sundays. Chuckles, soft laughters. And that was another awakening for me that day, that CHamoru stand their ground when threatened and hold their head high in the face of adversity. Later that day, I ran into those 2 students and gave them the meanest atibaba I could muster. I think in today's world, they call that look F-A-F-O. One student I never saw outside of class. The other one became my friend. Fast forward, after decades of cultural renaissance movements and revivals, after changing political landscapes and archaeological discoveries and protests, to a day of profound confirmation of self-identity. On August 8th, 2023, an email arrived from Family Tree DNA that changed the gravity of my world. My Y DNA was a direct match to archaeological remains from Guam and Northern Marianas. My whole body surged with energy. I jumped up and pumped my fist and I said, yeah! It was the purest elation I had ever known. A lightning strike of, I knew it. But when the adrenaline faded and the weight of it rushed in, I welled up. I felt humbled yet empowered. And for the first time in my life, I felt completely grounded. A mental dam broke and a wave of thoughts flooded my mind. A confusing typhoon of who I was versus who I now know I am. Looking back, that ethereal thread, that same one that gave a delinquent kid from Guam his dignity in a 1981 Oregon classroom, was finally pulling me home. It pulled me back into a lucid stillness, the state where answers come, and I braced myself for the path ahead. On August 11th, the results sharpened. My DNA pointed directly to Naton Beach in Guåhan and Anawan in Saipan. My first male ancestor of Guåhan was born around 1450 BC, over 3,000 years ago. My first connection to Saipan followed in 700 BC. This revelation reawakened a knowing in me. It dismantled the artificial separation of the islands that I've been taught my whole life. Our ties go back to the first people. We are a single lineage that can never be severed by modern borders. Perhaps that's why the thread pulled me to Saipan first. Standing at the foot of a concrete slab at Aguon, where the Mañaina lay buried beneath, I felt a low thrum start at my feet and travel to my head. I became lightheaded, but intensely present. Colors sharpened. I felt woven into the wind, into the cries of the sihik in the gabu trees and the faha spiraling in the sky. I was communing with the Mañaina of Aguon. I wasn't just a visitor. I was kin. I thanked them for answering my call and for blessing me with their presence. I promised I would be back. I left Saipan more rooted in self than I'd ever been, consciously aware now of a sacred connection that my history tried to erase. I made it to Naton finally 2 months later. What began as a leisurely stroll along the Tiempon shoreline ended with a step into a hole deeper than the one that confronted me in 1981. When I finally reached the beach of Naton, the beauty was jarring. The water was perfect, postcard turquoise. The sand was warm, the water was clear. It was a surface level paradise. But as I walked, the superficial beauty vanished. There was no deep connection like what I experienced at Aguon. I felt an absence, as if I'd been swallowed into the pit of the earth, a dark, suffocating void where no light could reach. It was the emptiness of a home that had been hollowed out. In the darkness, I made a promise. I whispered to the sand I would not let them stay in boxes. I would bring the Mañaina of Naton, all 370 of them, home. The promise became a mission, an effort to fulfill a soul-level responsibility that had been ignored for too long. The mission began with a simple inquiry. I reached out to the general manager of the Loti Hotel, asking a question no one had raised in years. What are the plans for the Naton Mañaina? To my surprise, the door opened. The GM acknowledged this inherited mandate and contacted the State Historic Preservation Office. For a moment, I felt that thread was steady. But as 2005 drew to a close, that thread didn't just hum. It pulsed with an ancient authority that pulled me from the sidelines. I stopped waiting for news and started delivering my birthright, transforming my inquiry into a formal declaration of existence. In the first week of the new year, I hand-delivered the notice of lineal descent to the Shippo's office. I realized that I was the voice of the lineage itself. In January, I thought I'd found a way forward. But when the government formally recognized my connection to the site, it felt like a victory, a moment of inclusion. As the weeks went by, however, this inclusion revealed itself as a hollow seat at a very small table. While I waited for the dialogue, things were moving in secret. Orders were issued to begin sifting remains from their preserved soil. To the unseen eye, the soil is just debris, but it is actually a protective matrix. It preserves the most fragile, fragmented pieces of our ancestors and holds the micro-artifacts that tell the unspoken details of their lives. Sifting them out was the destruction of the very things that make them human. Furthermore, a 2x2 meter plot was chosen for reinterment without a single conversation with the families. When I realized that my seat at the table was just a performance, I stopped waiting for an invitation. I filed a cease and desist notice with the Shippo and hand-delivered copies to the governor's office, the oversight chair, and every senator of the 38th Guam legislature. To this day, there has been no formal response. We are at a standstill. But the silence doesn't have the power to stop me anymore. When the doors of bureaucracy slammed shut, that lucid stillness returned. I realized that I didn't need permission to be a descendant. I stopped asking for a seat at the table and started building my own. I stopped pleading for a voice and started writing a new reality. My greatest fear was that the Mañaina of Naton would be reinterred away from where they lived and were buried, out of sight of the ocean, the very ocean that brought them here. I could not fathom our ancestors being stacked, one upon the other, in a 2x2 meter plot by the hotel tennis courts on the other side of the street. If the current system couldn't provide an appropriate home for our Mañaina, I would have to envision one on my own. The ethereal thread started thrumming, and visions of the abandoned bungalows of the Naton burial complex filled my mind. These structures have been sitting vacant for nearly the same amount of time the Naton ancestors have been stored in boxes. The foundation is already there. All that's left to do is build it. With this ancestor-inspired clarity, my mission to bring home the Naton Mañaina became an unshakable, sacred duty. I delved into the 3-volume archaeological investigations of the Naton beach site, Tuban Bay, Guam. The required final report submitted by SWCA environmental consultants in collaboration with a group of meticulous, insightful, and dedicated archaeologists and scientists. The more I read, the prouder I became to be a descendant. I found details that stopped me in my tracks, like the discovery of 12 pre-Lati ancestors whose remains were anointed with red or yellow ochre. Their final farewells, were empowered with sacred ritual, a final act of spiritual protection that has endured for over 3,000 years. The deeper I delved, the deeper my love grew for the Marianas and for the first people who settled their shores. I saw evidence of a society that valued artistry and inherited an earned status, from meticulously carved ornaments to tools that spoke of a mastery of sea and earth. This was an evolving society of architects, scientists, artists, and navigators. The more I discovered, the more urgent my desire grew for creating a respectful homecoming that honors and celebrates the 370 Mañaina. In the report, I was drawn to 5 key Mañaina distinguished by their unprecedented grave goods and the implications of their roles in the Naton lineage. They form an unbroken line from settlement to contact, proving that Naton was a sovereign community up until European contact. Their whispers became the quiet force that guided me and pushed me forward. Manaotaomo'na, the golden matriarch. A massive pinctada maxima found nestled under her left hand is the only one discovered in the Mariana Island archaeology today. This may represent singular authority. The presence of gout suggests unrestricted access to high-protein foods. The labial abrasion on her teeth is a distinct marker of the pre-Lati elite. The shell adze and fishhook preforms suggest that she had control over the essential technological and maritime tools required for the clan's survival. This Saina of Naton was interned with tridacnia circlets so aged that they had turned to gold. Manaotaomo'na represents the radiance of our ancient lineage, the matriarchal sun that our society revolved around. Aliba Saina, the adorned matriarch. A massive pinctada margaritifera, a black-lip oyster, lay at her left elbow, another unprecedented find in Mariana archaeology. A fragment from one of the 17 Anadara circlets gracing her neck, dated to 860 to 740 BC, confirming that Naton was one of the earliest settlements in the Marianas. Aliba Saina is the physical proof of a culture that valued beauty and grace and the sacred role of women as keepers of the lineage. Menfazi Sasjan, the master navigator. He is the last of the Sainas with the unprecedented massive Pintara shell, a black-lipped one. A masterly crafted spherical tridacna fishing weight the size of a golf ball. Another unique find in the Marianas lay by his hand. His osteology report suggests his skeletal robustity indicates intense maritime labor. Menfazi Sasjan is the heartbeat of the seafaring spirit of Naton, a wayfinder who mastered the deep blue seaways long before the world knew we existed. Metut. She is the only Saina of the 12 pre-Lati ancestors to be anointed with both red and yellow ochre. Red pigment covered her chest and arms, while yellow adorned her lower right leg and right hand, a dual anointing that suggests a profound role of mediation between the physical and spiritual worlds. Her status and importance to the Naton lineage is undeniable. She was buried with 12 drilled tiger shark teeth, 61 finely crafted conch shell beads, a large shell fish hook, a pumice file, 2 modified whole shells, and 2 large ritual stones, one stained with red pigment. Her unique burial placement suggests she was a sentinel. While the reports record the data, as a descendant, I see in Metut the ancestral roots of the Makana, the spiritual leaders who guarded our people's transition between the living and the dead. Ma'adzik Guanaha, the final heir, the promised child. At just 12 years old, this heir of Naton held nearly all the wealth found in the all Lati Arab burials at the site. 7 large spondylus beads lay at her waist, and 19 smaller ones were found on her upper body. But she was the heir to more than just wealth. She was the promised custodian of Naton's entire legacy of survival. Found with her were a shell gorge, a coral tool, a stone adze, a pounder, and a bone awl, the complete toolkit of our endurance. The addition of 8 European glass trade beads marks her as proto-historic, but they were merely ornaments on an ancient lineage. She is the embodiment of a culture standing on the threshold of change, holding her sovereignty while the world around her shifted. Ma'adzik Guinaha is the proof that the Naton lineage did not vanish. She carried our torch across the threshold into the present day. In the next few months, I poured my heart and soul into creating a blueprint for the sanctuary that treats our ancestors not as obstacles, but as a foundation of our identity. I didn't wait for another meeting that would never happen or a promise that would be broken. Because when the ancestors whisper, you don't wait for permission to act, you move. I recently finalized the Naton Accord, a tripartite covenant between the landowner, the governor, and the lineal descendants. It's a vision of stewardship, permanent protection, and a sanctuary where science and spirit speak the same language. It fulfills the legal mandates of reburial by creating a permanent private-public partnership while creating a world-class cultural, educational, and tourism asset for the people of Guam. The Accord will create the Naton legacy, transforming a dormant structure of the Lati Hotel into a world-class museum, ancestral crypt, interpretive archive, spiritual center, and museum. Most importantly, it will provide a dignified resolution for the 370 Naton ancestors, including a 2,500-year-old founding lineage. Guided by the insistent thumbing of that thread, I bypassed the gatekeepers and went straight to the top, sending the Naton Accord directly to the chairman and CEO of KB Financial Group in Seoul. This group manages an umbrella of companies, including the owner of the Lotte Hotel. It was received on May 7th. I didn't reach out to them as a petitioner asking for a favor. I reached out as a descendant offering a solution. I framed this accord as the pinnacle of ESG leadership, environmental, social, and governance. In the global market, a corporation is judged by how it honors the social fabric of the land it occupies. By partnering in the Naton Legacy Sanctuary, KB Financial has the opportunity to move from being a developer sitting on a burial site to a global leader in indigenous stewardship. It was the ultimate act of a realized self-identity. I stopped speaking as someone waiting for permission and started speaking as a steward who finally knows what our ancestors deserve. My journey began with a hole in my heart in 1981 and led me to a pit in the sands of Naton. But in that darkness, I connected with a larger us than I ever imagined. My self-awareness expanded the moment I realized my DNA is a 3,000-year-old map. But my identity was only realized when I chose to follow that map home. We are not defined by the borders drawn by others, but the promises we keep to those who came before us. I am no longer a delinquent kid in Oregon, wondering where I belong. I am a son of the Marianas and a voice for the Naton 370. The Golden Mother gave me dignity. The adorned matriarch, pride. The master navigator wove me into the wind and lifted my eyes to the stars. The spiritual garden is the thrum that brings me lucid stillness when the world is loud. And the promised child of Naton whispers, hold the torch tight, reminding me of my sacred duty to fulfill the promise for those who will come after. Thank you for having me here today. It's been an honor and a joy.
So as I had mentioned, I mean, even I got a little teary-eyed, right? He is just amazing in his passion, his dedication, who he is, and what he brings forward for all of us, and his artistry. So I was kind of teasing that maybe he should be at the end because his presentation is so visually amazing that going on second, which is me, becomes a little bit harder. But with my presentation, I am now the curator, well, one of the curators. Dr. Maggette is the chief curator for the museum and the repository, and I am the curator who is now heading up and building our first ever Cultural Anthropology and History section. And so working on my presentation was a really important journey because right now we've built a really strong foundation. We're running in some ways 100 miles an hour, We're working so hard to bring collections in, to get repatriation and rematriation happening, to be working with the community, descendants such as Bal, while we are currently the caretakers and housing the Mañaina, and all of that. At the same time, we are trying to find our way forward with setting up databases as we go through the collections, as we go through the associated records. How can we set up databases that are going to best serve the work that we do, but also the CHamoru people and the community as well? So with mine, it's entitled the Ginen I Manaotåomo'na, or from the ancestors, or from those who were before us, because with the work that we do, it's really an opportunity to listen to the ancestors, to pay attention to what they left behind and what it is saying to us about the lives that they led and the lives that we should be leading as we work with them. So I'm so incredibly grateful for all of the elders, the Saina, the cultural practitioners, the historians, the archaeologists, my colleagues and team members at the museum and the repository. What I've put together is just the beginning of that journey of what we all bring when we work together. And so I'll be looking at 3 ancestral villages. These are the first 3. This is the initial part of the journey, and we hope to build on and grow from here. So, I forgot, I am in charge. I have the clicker. So, we're looking at 2 villages that are part of what we today call Tumon Bay. We're looking at part of Tiempon and Naton. So it seemed like such a good fit after Bao gave us such a connection to and being able to visualize those who had been there before. And we've also been working pretty intently with a village that archaeologists have been referring to for many decades as Motsum, but we are researching to find out what the real ancestral name of that village would be. So in this first part, in looking at Naton, one of the things that's important to understand are, if we're going to look at the 2 different eras, the pre-Lati and the Lati. So for the pre-Lati, looking at some of the ornaments that are part of what the ancestors left behind, nearly 95% of what they adorned themselves with was out of conus shells. So in the light orange circle, these are 3 types of conus shells, 3 types of drilling into and creating conus shell beads. Then in the orange, as you saw, that was so wonderfully illustrated in Val's presentation, we have the circlets that are quite unique and special, and then 12 tiger sharp teeth that adorned someone as well. And the Lati period, we see that spondylus has become so iconic. We still work with hema, clamshell, conus shells, and other shells, but spondylus has really become a strong part of identity. And so we do see that for what ancestors were adorning themselves with, it did become largely spondylus, and this is where spondylus pendants started to show up. Still a couple of sharp teeth, and you'll notice here in this orange circle that we start to see the contact with Europeans as they were coming through. A while ago, we used to have to convince some of the archaeologists and others that 1521 wasn't the beginning of Spanish colonization or any of that. You still had a lengthy period of time where I Manaotåomo'na were living very traditional lives. But they were starting to incorporate certain things, iron, glass beads, and that, but still living their traditional lives. And so because this is really a large population, and it has a large number of adornments, it tells us a lot. And so some of what we can say that has been learned is that down here in the circle, that women's status, we know it inherently, but we also see it then within what ancestors are telling us about themselves. That women's status was relatively high, that more women than men were buried with ornaments, then they had higher numbers of ornaments they were buried with, and more diversity of types of ornaments. But not everybody was buried with ornaments, so we know that there was differentiation. Infants and youth were buried, some with ornaments, so of course showing those core values of caring for family and possibly telling us of inherited status. There was essentially no difference between men and women being buried with goods, and a relatively high number of grave goods suggests a higher social position than others in Tumon Bay. And we do see this when we look at the other villages. We do see differences in numbers. So if we look more specifically for the pre-Lati, over here we do also see a difference between pre-Lati and Lati patterns. For the pre-Lati, you had a little less than half of the 370, and yet they have 1,644 of the 1,700 ornaments, so almost all of the ornaments are theirs. About 94 ornaments were for the other 210 that were of the Lati population. So 27% had ornaments when they were buried for pre-Lati, whereas just 9% were buried with ornaments in the Lati period. Women were slightly more than twice as likely as men to be buried with ornaments in pre-Lati era, and if anything, this becomes a stronger situation where we have women were about 3.5 times more likely than men to be buried with ornaments. But what we do see is burials had, yes, they had fewer ornaments, but they had more utilitarian grave goods. And then to show you some of them, you got quite a vision of many of them from Bal as well. But some of the ones that were from that pre-Lati time period, we have some sizable fish hooks, gorges, the sinker that he mentioned, shell adze, and then from the Lati period, we have sling stones and other types of adze. So for part of Tiempon, now this is a later ancestral village. For Naton, as Val mentioned, it started, they think it began maybe 2,755 or so years ago, so much older, having a very strong, lengthy pre-Lati period. Whereas at least this part of Tiempon seems to have begun maybe about 1,000 years ago, so much closer to the Lati period or the beginnings of the Lati period, maybe having a bit of the end of what we, in archaeology in modern times, certainly not in ancestral times, that we refer to as maybe of having some time for the pre-Lati. But going all the way up to the 15th centuries, and so that's one of the things that we see in Tiempon, and even for the other village on the other coast, is that they were living ancestrally, being themselves, being sovereign, until Spanish colonization. So in this burial, we have nearly 500 individuals that were found, and a continuation of marine shell, shark teeth, and more, along with various types of burial goods. You see a much different number. No longer do we have 1,700, but more in line with the other Lati population of Naton, who had 93 ornaments, we see 153 ornaments or possible ornaments. And at this part of Tonghon, it's actually in the location of the Hyatt Hotel. Many people don't know this, but 50 yards away from the ballroom is where they are reinterred. There is a reinterment marker. There is a site set aside for their reinterment. And so we've begun letting people know that are holding events there that really just so close to them is this reinterment site, and to start considering having a moment of silence or a moment of recognition of those ancestors who were so close by. And just to make a note also that when these ancestors were buried, any grave goods that were associated with them were buried along with them. So 147 of these ornaments were beads or bead preforms. And so part of what we're doing and will be really important in our database is understanding we're very familiar and very much appreciate seeing the different variations of conus bead, of spondylus bead, and other beads and pendants. But to know that there were also some stone beads, there were at times bone beads, and this is where we start to see, again, in the Lati period, that they start moving into having pendants. And a continuation of the drilled shark's tooth. So for some reason I find that really interesting, and I want to definitely learn more about these shark teeth and the role that they played. So with the grave goods, one of the things that they really noted was this high level of fishing gear that seemed to be buried along with or alongside, but there was also a lot of heavy disturbance. So they are very tentative in calling these grave goods. Also interesting was that there was an iron axe head, maybe a food offering that was buried with a child, that there were quite a few ceramic vessels, some placed where the skull was, or along other parts of the body. What looks like bone procurement, which we know was very much a part of their life. And also, I think this really speaks to who they were, in that there were 5, maybe 7 cases of leprosy, and some to the degree, like for one individual, they lost a hand and part of a leg, but they had the ability and the knowledge to have it heal and to live for years afterwards. So it speaks to inclusion, knowledge and skill in healing and all of that. And then for the area that's referred to as Motsum, this is one of the oldest villages in all of the Marianas, dating back to potentially 3,500 or more years ago. And again, staying until the Spanish missionization efforts. The I Manaotåomo'na, there are at least 143 individuals that are there. Some were left in place. And for body ornamentation, again, we see much the same patterns of marine shells, shark teeth, and more, along with burial goods. There were 102 artifacts identified as ornaments. So we don't really know the difference, why there might be 1,700 or more in in Naton, and why for a village that's even older that also had a pre-Lati population, why they might only have 102. So one of the things that we were very excited about, as far as I've been told, there are very few fully intact or nearly fully intact kulu that have been found. At Motsum, there is this beautiful, amazing kulu that, as you can see, these photographs were taken by, this is where, a part of where I was saying it's all of us working together. This is from the Archaeological Collection Division that was responsible for taking these photographs, as well as all of the displays that were put together. And we have Vanessa Dueñas here, who was one of the ones. We have some museum assistants, Kate Kitachai and Gianna Demian, who also were part of putting this, taking these photographs. Oh, wait. Is there anybody in the booth? We turned off the sound for Bal's video. I don't know if it's possible to, because here in the Kulu, it's amazing to hear a Kulu that was from that ancestral time, and to think about it. It's a beautiful, Motsum is a beautiful site if you're familiar with the Manila Golf Course area. It's a very powerful, beautiful place. And to think of the sound coming out of that Kulu, rolling along the hills, across the cliffside, and then down along the bay in the sandy areas and out into the ocean is just amazing. So I might try to come back to this just so that we can hear that Kulu. And then for the last slide that I have, so yes, there were the fewer beads, 90 of them out of the 102 ornaments were shell and clay beads, but we also have shark tooth again, and something that people have wondered, the roles and the connectedness of Finihi to I Manaotåomo'na, but I don't know that any of us had wondered or thought about the possibility that they might have taken some of their long bones or other bones and modified them and smoothed them and possibly polished them so that they might serve as beads. That's the interpretation, is they think that they may have formed them into beads. So in order to sort of illustrate this, I used some of the art here by David Lujan Zablon, who was an important part of being able to figure out re-envisioning I Manaotaomo'na. And he and Al Lizama were two of the earliest artists that started to revive that and bring that back. Help us understand and have art that depicted the life and lifeways of I Manaotaomo'na. He passed away from cancer last year, but I wanted to have a photo of him to show just who he was that created this kind of connection in artistry. So with that, Sainamaasi, as you see, we have a very big journey ahead of us, but part of what is so important is this is not privately owned. As much as we appreciate all of the historians and university professors and archaeologists that work with these artifacts, that work with these records, that reconnect us in so many ways to that, but that is information that can come and go. What we're building up at the database is something that belongs to the people, that this is information that will go in, be part of the database, and as we enter information month after month, year after year, collection after collection, we will start to be able to go to that database and say, okay, how common were Kulu? And then we can find all the villages they were found at. Like, one of the things that we don't know is there was a difference between I Manaotaomo'na who lived along the coast and I Manaotaomo'na that lived inland. Did the inland I Manaotaomo'na, did they use Kulu? The only Kulu, as far as we know, there have only been about 3 that have been found archaeologically, and they're in coastal areas. So all of this information is something that helps us understand more of who everybody was at that particular time. If we find one stone bead and we find it interesting, then we can start to go to our database and find out how many villages and how often did they have stone beads? How often did they have Finihi bones that were beads? Right now, we know of 1. but we might know of more, and then altogether that information will provide us even more understanding of I Manaotåomo'na and connecting them. Pulin, is it possible to for me to play the pulu? It's ready? So we'll go back. I don't know about you, but I just love, I think it's important for us to all hear the kulu. Oh, wait, I guess I have to go back twice. All right, we'll see if we can get it to, no, the sound's not coming through. They're going to try one more time, 3 times the charm maybe. Okay, you got to hear part of it. So it's just an amazing sound. And to think that the last time before Dave blew it, it had been blown hundreds of years prior by I Manaotaomo'na living as sovereigns in their land. So, Sana Ma'asi, thank you for your attention, and I will move to introducing our next presenter. So our next presenter is Edward, also known as Pulin Speaks, Leon Guerrero. He has a master's degree in Micronesian Studies, and he is about to set his journey into being a PhD candidate. So we're very excited for him. And if you haven't watched Pulin Speaks yet, you absolutely must. He takes very complex, very pertinent questions that we're all dying to know answers to or more about. And he does deep dives, does deep research, and then boils it down into 3, 6, 9 minutes or so and passes it on to us. So we're incredibly grateful for all of that he provides us. Everybody that I've ever run across who has watched it is already a fan, and we're talking about even some of our elders in their 80s have told me that they listen to him and they're convinced when he says it. Also, I do want to mention one other thing, that at least on some of his videos, I've been part of video projects with Pulin actually, and some of our videos got 2,000 or 3,000 hits, and it was like, woo, that's a big deal. Some of his videos get like 285,000 views, so a whole nother league. So with that, let me introduce Pulin, and he will introduce his topic for you.
I'll be sure to give you some money afterwards for saying that wonderful introduction for me. Bonus and half a day, everyone. I know it's almost 3:20, which we're supposed to end, so I'll keep mine very brief, right, to save time for the next presentator. And besides, I won't have to speak that much either. I could just make a video, and then you can all check that out later about the topic I'm going to say. So just to be brief about this, is I'm going to talk about a little bit about art, political claims making, right, and the reason why. Today, across the island, you could see lattes, you could see visuals of art, lattes, senahis. Who here is wearing a senahi right now? Do I have, oh, right there, we got one senahi there, two. Anyone else? 3? I think you, Josh, I think you're wearing a senahi over there too. I see that too, right? Why are we seeing lots of these identifiers today that did not exist, amongst our grandparents or our great-grandparents, or for some of you here, your parents, right? Generations. So why is that too? And I'm just going to briefly say it's connected. It's connected to a global ethnic revival that was occurring in the 1960s, 1970s, and 1980s, right? The CHamoru Renaissance. It's connected to that. It wasn't just a localized event that was just happening here in the Marianas in isolation, right? it was connected to these global factors. So what was occurring in the 60s, in the 70s, in the 80s that led to this? Well, for starters, we saw, one, a big wave of decolonization occurring. In the 1960s, which was called the Year of Africa, we had more than 18 independent countries. We saw the fall of the British Empire, the fall of the Dutch Empire, the fall of the French Empire, where so many countries were becoming independent. And that included countries here in the Pacific, like Fiji in 1970. So there's this big political wave of decolonization occurring. Also, what we see too is we saw the United Nations, right? The prominent, we all heard about the United Nations, right? Where we have a big council of people with placards from each and every country, right? The United Nations, more than anything, pushed the concept to all of us, to the world. A concept called human rights, right? And I know some leaders, some political leaders tend to ignore human rights. But this has very powerful rhetorical effect and is a powerful tool for people to use, right? Human rights, right? Which includes indigenous rights. So for the very first time, we saw issues such as marginalization of indigenous people and exploitation of indigenous people being brought to the international stage for the very first time in a prominent way. And this is why it's not a coincidence that we saw the Red Power movement, right? The Red Power movement, where we saw Native Americans strongly asserting their sovereignty in the United States, for example. We saw Chicano, right? You know, the Hispanics in America strongly asserting their ethnic identity. We've seen it all around the world. The Kanaka Maoli in Hawaii, right? You know, the indigenous in Aotearoa, New Zealand. This was happening in the 70s, in the 80s. This was all happening. Heck, we even see all the way in the United Kingdom, in England, we saw people known as the Cornish people. No, not corned beef hash, right? The Cornish people exerting that they exist, that they are not English, that they have their own language, that they are reviving their own language, their own literature, and that's what was happening in the 70s and in the 80s too. So you're seeing this happening all around the world. And also we saw the civil rights movement happening, right? The civil rights was a big inspiration to people. And finally, we saw indigenous people here from the Marianas getting education in these institutions in the United States, in these other places where they begin to learn about these human rights, about how the United Nations work, about, hey, you know, it's important that we politically mobilize, right? Because think about it, back in the 1920s, you know how many percentage of Americans, young adults 18 through 21, were attending college? Around 10%. That number in the 1960s, for example, tripled, quadrupled to 30 to 40%. So now we see college and education, more access to everything. And plus, you know, we see technology of the internet, right? Or sorry, not the internet, of TV, television, broadcasting, right? Now the world was becoming more globalized than ever. So all of that brought together, right? Brought together where the Chamorro people in the 1970s, in the 1980s, they started developing a political conscience, right? And what's more, and what I don't want to do is to tell you what Chamorro identity is for the purposes of this presentation. Rather, I want to tell you how is Chamorro identity used, right? How is it used for political claims making, right? How is it used? That, to me, is the important question. How is the utilization of the Senahi, the development of Chamorro dance incorporating pre-colonial elements, how is that being utilized to further the Chamorro people? Because you see, in the late 1960s, for the very first time here in the island of Guam, we saw the government of Guam pass the very first law that explicitly protects Chamorro culture, as stated in that legislation, which includes bilingual cultural classes, right? I believe in 1969, you know, I'll make a video about it later. So we start seeing this happening, this push, right, in the 70s, in the 80s. And by no coincidence, we also see the development of pre-colonial forms of Chamorro dancing in the 1980s, right? We can thank Carlos Taitano, right? He was an intellectual juggernaut with that. And then he, along with Frank Rabon, right? They began developing these dances. We saw the revival of seafaring amongst the Chamorro people, and you know we have two founders right there of seafaring, Canuga and seafaring right there here with us, right? We start seeing this happening throughout this period, the 70s, the 80s, okay? And so how is this utilized? Why is it that Chamorros then start seeing, or people start wearing senahis, the spondylus, right? Seafaring, which they didn't do in the 1940s, in the 50s, in the 1920s, right? They were doing the, bailali natla, right? They were doing the cha-cha, right? They were doing other forms of dancing. They were wearing my grandma would have never worn a senahi or a spondylus, right? My grandma was wearing the golden things, right? The golden, I forgot what those are called, but
7-day bracelets.
7-day bracelets. Yeah, that's what they're wearing. So, what's occurring is that the Chamorro people, right? What's occurring is that they were facing pressure. This was a direct response to the increasing demographic marginalization, the increasing not only demographic marginalization, but the political atmosphere being charged with this rhetoric of decolonization. Okay, all of these factors and the archaeological discoveries that were occurring, like at Naton Beach site, right, that we were seeing. So all of these were fueling together, where now Chamorros are like, hey, we're different from other people here on island, right? I'm different from you, Kelly. I'm different from you. I'm different from you. We're Chamorro. And one of the most powerful rhetorical tool, or powerful, or whatever you want to frame it, is indigeneity. The fact that no other people could claim to have a 3,500-year descent in the island. Okay? That is a powerful claim that helps the Chamorro people maintain their presence here in the island despite colonialism, right? Despite marginalization, despite the massive demographic changes. So each time that, you wear your senahi, or a kid draws a picture of Chikapuha and so on, that is actually, important, whether they are conscious or unconscious of it not, because what they are doing is that they are asserting that they have an indigenous claim to the island, that they are distinct from all the other groups. And due to that, that is how the Chamorro people on Guam has maintained, even through the government of Guam and through institutions, of promoting Chamorro culture, language, right, in a United States colony. Imagine that. And the last thing I just want to state, right, is that, I don't want it to be assumed that just because you're wearing a senahi, or because you are, Gulf Chamorro, or Chamorro, these identifiers and the rhetoric could be utilized and interpreted in different ways. Because again, Chamorro identity, it's not static, it's not a singular, it's not a unified, it is in fact variable, right? It is very flexible, it is very fluid, and that is how we have people who are not only, right, we have people who are Chamorro, who are also claim and they strongly support patriotic to America, right? Who are also Catholic, right? Who are liberal or conservative, and so on and so on. Because again, like I said, we don't want to assume a homogeneous Chamorro. It could be interpreted in many different ways, okay? But still, what's important is that they could claim distinction. This is the key point. Distinction, that they are different, utilizing the rhetoric, the concept of indigeneity to maintain the positionality on here in the Marianas, which is in line with with this global event that was happening in the 70s, 80s, and still continues today. And I will have more details about this. This is what I'm studying for my dissertation, right? So you got a little glimpse of it. So yeah. So again, thank you very much, everyone, for attending, and seduce Masi.
So our final presentation today is from Dr. Michael Guåhan Bavacqua, also known as Maget. And in introducing him, I want to point out, as I mentioned earlier, he is our chief curator here. And the growth of the museum has been a wonderful thing. I know at least one of our visitors was mentioning that she was last here at the very beginning, so maybe many of us were here during FestPac, the inaugural opening of this museum in this spot. And the ways that we've seen it build and grow since that time has been, I get to see it up close, but it's been amazing. It's dynamic, it's ongoing. We have events happening from 10 in the morning sometimes till 10 at night. Just one group is practicing here, another group is practicing there. There's a talk going on in here. There's a film festival, different exhibits and so forth. So it's just been amazing. And Maget has really been at the core of a lot of that. So he, I have long thought, accomplishes more, maybe twice as much as, at least I can say for me, but I think for a lot of us. He runs a blog spot, he writes for the PDN regularly and has done so for many years. He's heading up our repatriation and rematriation efforts. He runs immersion classes. They're going into, third, fourth, maybe more years. And has been running a free online Zoom class, I can now say ever since, because it's been going on for so long. And even before he began some of his academic journey, he was already putting conferences together. I went out to California many, many years ago at one of the first conferences that he put together. So a very dynamic person who is at the forefront of really making the museum about the community and one of the people's houses. So with that, I will call Dr. Bavacqua to come and make his presentation.
Oh, Biba, okay. All right. So, I am here to close this panel and to talk about the Guam Museum and the origins of the Guam Museum and, of course, its relationship to the Chamorro people. And so, the Guam Museum is started in 1932, although the first time that we know that the Chamorro people talk about the idea of the Guam Museum is a few years earlier than that. But part of why we want to talk about this is because the museum as it is today, in the room that we're in the building that we're in, with all that it provides, but it begins in this building, in the Plaza de España, where its claim to fame was that Filipino revolutionaries were massacred in there, in the famous Christmas massacre at the end of the Spanish period of Guam's history. And so, to go from this building to then what we have today, over close to a century. And what is sort of the Guam Museum to the Chamorro people in particular at the very beginning? Because one of the things that I'm always interested in as somebody who has studied colonization, decolonization, is what happens when institutions come into Guam with a certain dynamic, a certain framework, a certain idea, and then can Chamorros change them? Can people change them? Can they, if they were meant to serve one purpose, can they serve a different purpose? And so the Guam Museum is actually started, not necessarily by Chamorros, but it started by veterans that had retired on Guam, many of whom were married to Chamorros. And so the name that constantly appears is Hiram Elliott, who had married a Chamorro woman. And so Hiram Elliott was the person who, in the early days of the Guam Museum, after it's formed in 1932, is basically the person who's keeping the lights on. In fact, he appears in the pre-World War II newspaper. He even goes so far, if you look at newspapers in his hometown and newspapers across the United States, he would send letters to the editor in his hometown and to other places saying, please donate to us. please send money, please send artifacts, please send items, so that we can fill things in our museum. He said, if you've got stuff for Guam, great, but what we'd really like is anything historical, anything Native American or Indian relics would be really nice, he said. And one of the reasons, though, actually, that the Guam Museum is started is because, now, if you read the Guam Recorder, when the Guam Museum is started, there's a lot of opining that the history of the locals is disappearing, the history of the locals don't know their history. Papa? And so there needs to be a museum to preserve it and so on like that. But really, one of the intents is simply that people who are visiting Guam say that there's nothing to do on Guam. And so people who are stationed on Guam say there's nothing to do. People who visit the island say they can't learn about the local history, the local culture. And so there is this feeling, which persists up until today in some ways, that there's nothing to do on Guam. And so the idea behind this, sort of the unspoken idea, at least in terms of the Guam Recorder and the official record, is let's create a museum where people who are visiting have something to do, and let's showcase something local for them. And so in the early days, you get the sense from Hiram's letters to the editor and in the Guam Recorder that the museum does not have a lot of support. There's not a lot of financial support for it. There's some people who donate artifacts, but there's not a lot of support for it. The Chamorro people don't really support the museum. Some stuff gets dropped off, but it doesn't have a broad community support. Now in 1936, the US naval government takes over the management of the museum, and this is when things start to change. Aguon Johnston, who had been a part of the museum from the beginning in sort of a more informal sense, becomes sort of officially part of one of the collection committee, sort of overseeing ancient and modern Chamorro collections. There's Chamorros who begin to work for the museum officially. There's a Joaquin Uggan. This is William Gay, who's half Chamorro and half white, and he starts to work at the museum too. And so more Chamorros are working there, and we see that the museum starts to change. There's funding for it. There's also the US Navy also provides that a curator from the Bishop Museum comes and starts to work, collecting, building up a collection for the museum to get started over several months. And so you see a huge difference in the pre-World War II newspaper, the Guam Recorder, because in 1937, every month, there's something showcasing information or what you can find or what has been donated to the Guam Museum. Now, the Chamorro perspective on this, as I was just mentioning. In 1926, the Guam Recorder reports that Chamorros, for the first time as far as we know, express a desire to have a museum, that Guam should have a museum. And it's the Guam Teachers Association, which incidentally is also the group that created the Magellan Monument, which is down in Humaktak. And so they basically say, in the name of preserving indigenous articles that have historical, prehistorical significance, for the children, for the island, we should begin to collect things, and they should be in a museum. Ramon Sablan, who was not a doctor yet, but would become the first Chamorro medical doctor, is put in charge of things. There's calls that all the school children on Guam should help with this. Aguon Johnston, who we talked about, becomes essential in this. And so Chamorros at this time are thinking about a museum for sure. There's definitely interest behind it. Now, one of the things as to why Chamorros are interested in this, though, is actually a very unfortunate thing. But this is sort of the complicated nature of identity and culture. Is that in the 1920s, we see a massive, almost appalling amount of archaeological collecting by Hans Hornbostel that takes place in Guam and the Marianas. It was assumed to be in the thousands. It's actually closer to 12,000 pieces that he collected total in just a few years. And so, this is Hans Hornbostel, his wife, and Thompson, another Navy officer, collecting a latte from Ipoh, and the latte is out there. You can go visit it because we got it back last year. And so Hornbostel went around the island to latte sites, digging with the help of CHamoru's, with the help of CHamoru's, with the support of the US Navy, who gave him a place to store things, to process things. He also had the help of the US Navy soldiers who would go with him if he was in places where CHamoru's were not willing to allow him to pass. And so Hans Hornbostel went around the island tearing through all sorts of cultural norms, cultural taboos, about what is the relationship between a Chamorro person and a slingstone, or a latte site, or an artifact that you find on the ground. And so for many of you, even up until today, if you see pottery on the ground, if you see a latte site, or if you see slingstones, you might think, I should be respectful, I shouldn't take anything, I shouldn't mess with this place, I don't want to get pinched, I don't want to get messed up. But Hornbostel at this time was running around Guam and then to a lesser extent the Northern Marianas. And he was digging things up, he was taking photographs with skulls, he was just dumping things in crates and sending them off to Hawaii by the thousands. And one of the things that he was very proud of was this right here. This was a program supported by the Bishop Museum at that time, in which young Chamorro children were told that if they could bring in an artifact from a latte site, from a cave, from a burial, they could get a free movie ticket. And so hundreds of artifacts were collected in this manner, that young Chamorro children were encouraged to go and raid historic sites and get movie tickets. And so, if you ever read Dr. Laura Thompson and her interviews with Chamorros at this time, you can see that there's cultural changes happening. Some of the interviews talk about how Chamorros are saying, oh, I don't really believe in that Tao'omo'na stuff, that's my parents. But you can see that Hornbostel's collecting intervenes into this, that Chamorros are being pushed into making choices, or their beliefs are being challenged, and that things are being taken. And that actually one of the big conversations that even reaches the point where the Navy is having it is, if we build a museum, can we actually get some of this stuff back that has been taken? Because so much has been taken. So even in the 1930s, so much had been taken to Hawaii. So there's the discussion that if we have a museum on Guam, can we actually get some of it back? Which seems astounding. And so this issue of so much of what Hornbostel done really pushes the issue of what is the connection that Chamorros have to these artifacts? Because for so long there was these norms in which you respect them in their place. That's what they are. You respect them as the artifacts of the ancestors. Leave them in their place. But as this amateur archaeologist goes around picking them up, encouraging the young people to grab them, it combines with feelings of anxiety over language being banned, culture being attacked by the Navy, pressures to Americanize. And so you can see then that this feeling of a museum in which things that are being lost can be preserved, Chamorros more and more feel like there might be something valuable about that. And so we see in the late 1930s, Chamorros accepting and embracing more and more the idea of this museum that's theirs. And by the By that time, Chamorros are bringing in artifacts of all sorts. They're bringing in things from the Spanish era. They're bringing in things from that era. They're bringing in woven things. They're bringing in ancient artifacts. And so the museum is a place in which the vitality that it had, we can't really understand or capture it because of the loss of the museum from World War II. And we can't understand it because our biggest image into it is the Guam Reporter. And the Guam Reporter stops talking about the museum at the time in which Chamorros strongly embrace it and are going there in increasing numbers and are finding increased ownership over it. So this is an image, an image of the Guam Museum at that time. And so there was these glass cases in which artifacts would be put inside them. And so it was exciting for Chamorros to visit this. And then to see that something that they had seen in the jungle all their lives, or something that their parents had used, or something just around the house, that it was behind glass, and that it had this value or history attached to it that they didn't understand before. And so, even in the Guam Recorder, you'll find that on days in which Chamorros came from all the villages to Hagatna to sell their products, to sell their wares on market days, the museum would be filled with people who would come to walk through and look at the exhibit, because to see with new eyes the things that they had just grown up around. But it's so sad because at this time at which the museum becomes a space for Chamorros is exactly the time that the Guam Recorder stops writing about it for 3 entire years. It does make some sense though, because the Guam Recorder was a newspaper which was for the white stateside military audience. And so they weren't necessarily interested in the space if it was for Chamorros. But some of the stories that I've collected or heard talk about bringing students and children in here, how it became a space in which kids, where the educational curriculum was so completely Americanized, it had almost not a single drop of anything dealing with Guam in it. But you could bring kids to the Guam Museum, especially if you were in Hagatna. You could bring them to the Guam Museum and you could walk them through. And that was one of the few places as a teacher at that time where you could actually have anything in your classroom that had anything local to do with it. The rest of the time there was nothing, almost nothing, with the exception of teaching them farming, or maybe teaching them pandanus weaving, or something like that. But this was a space in which you actually got to have a small amount of pride. And one of my favorite stories, though, is that students would be lined up here in front of these tables, in front of these cases, excuse me, and that they would get paper, and then they would have to draw the artifacts, right? Now you take a picture with it on your phone or something, but in those days, you would be in front of it for a minute or two, and then there would be like a sling stone in there would be an adze, or there would be a mortar and pestle, and you would have to draw it. And then after a minute or two, you would switch and move to the next case. And then you would have to draw that one. You draw it, and then you move to the next case. And so, in these sorts of, and so it's interesting to think about what this space might have been like at that time, when Chamorros finally got a sense of ownership over it. It was, unfortunately, to give an epilogue to this Guam Museum. This Guam Museum was completely destroyed in World War II. And almost everything was lost, and what was not lost was taken by Japanese soldiers to Japan, and we don't know what happened to that. But it is, for me though, this is an interesting sort of story, because at a time when you have an institution which comes into Guam, where its initial intent is really to create something for visitors to see. Just in the way in which when You think about how this building was actually created as something for tourists to see. But we work on it and we make it something in which the Chamorro people can be celebrated. And it's a place for Chamorro people to find themselves. And so, Sidus Masi for listening to my talk.
So we're exactly right on with the 3:30, at least according to my watch. So